So good afternoon and warmly welcome to today's seminar, also the last for this semester and academic year in terms of seminars. It will be given by Wally Cirafesi, our Professora Scientia Fellow, on the topic Ancient Synagogues and the Early History of Jewish-Christian Relations. Wally is a Professora Fellow here at SCAS, as I just mentioned, but he's also a researcher in New Testament studies in the Center for Theology and Religious Studies at Lund University. He completed his PhD in 2018 in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Oslo. His dissertation on the Gospel of John and its ancient Jewish context won the University of Oslo's King's Gold Medal Prize in 2019 and was recently published as a monograph in Brill's prestigious series Ancient Judaism and Early Christianity. And Wally was a postdoctoral fellow at the Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society in Oslo from 2019 to 2020. He has also held a number of visiting research fellowships, most notably at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the W.F. Albright Institute for Archaeological Research, and at the University of Oslo. Wally is a scholar of Jewish and Christian antiquity whose research spans and innovatively brings together the fields of biblical studies, early Jewish and Christian studies, classical archaeology, and the history of Jewish-Christian relations. And being still at a relatively early stage of career, he has published impressively widely on topics ranging from Hellenistic Greek philology, which was the topic of his first book, also published with Brill, to the Dead Sea Scrolls, early Christian manuscripts, and the centerpiece of much of his current research, ancient synagogues. Wally's third book is due to be published next year by Fortress Academic Press. And in this book, he provides, let's say, a micro-history of Jewish-Christian relations in a small village in ancient Palestine, known to many readers of the New Testament as Capernaum. The book, however, takes a long-term approach and focuses especially on the village's rich archaeological record from the time of the earliest Christians in the 1st century to the Byzantine Islamic transition in the 7th, and drawing on methodological tools from a range of fields such as economic history, anthropology, and architecture. The book is a creative exploration of the ways that Jewish and Christian identities were both constructed and challenged in one small corner of the Roman Empire, which nevertheless sheds light, great light, I should say, on larger questions about the history of Judaism and Christianity in this period. Warmly welcome, Wally.
Didn't know that we were keeping you captive here. Okay, well, thank you, Christina, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here and for tuning in if you're on Zoom. It's been an intellectually rewarding year being here at SCAS. It's been very, very formative for me. But by far the best part has been the relationships, I think, that have been built. I feel like I've made genuinely good friends being here for the last year. And I look forward to holding on to these relationships as well as time goes along. It really is a gift to have an opportunity to present my research project to you, to such a multidisciplinary group like this one. Most of us are coming from very different disciplinary backgrounds, so I thought I would take an hourglass approach to the talk today. I'll start on a quite broad and introductory level and then work my way down to some more specific questions and problems that I'm currently researching. At the end, I'll zoom back out and hopefully be able to talk a bit more and think a bit more about the broader intellectual consequences that my research is engaged in. The project I'm working on now has to do with the social and material history of ancient synagogues during the days of the Roman Empire, with a specific interest in the role that they played in the development of Jewish-Christian relations. The project takes a long-term approach. It stretches from around the time of the 1st century CE up to the Byzantine Islamic transition in the 7th century, and it focuses mainly, though certainly not exclusively, on sources coming from the Eastern Mediterranean. The project emerges in contrast to a long tradition of historiography that has constructed the synagogue in antiquity as a culturally and socially bound religious institution, altogether unique in the Roman world and on its way to becoming the quintessential center of an equally bound rabbinic Judaism. The resulting portrait, based mainly on the merit of polemical Jewish and Christian literary sources, has been that synagogues, and by extension Jewish communities throughout the ancient Mediterranean, were mainly insular and had mostly antagonistic relationships with early Christian communities. That is, with those who were supposedly irreconcilable rivals to them. My research aims to consider a broader range of source material, archaeological as well as literary, and you'll see some of that here today, to highlight that rather than insular institutions, ancient synagogues were embedded in their larger Greco-Roman socio-religious landscape. And as such, they were much more fluid and open to social and cultural interaction with non-Jews, including Christians, than previous scholarship has allowed for. The project is still very much in its infant stages, with lots of loose nuts and bolts. You'll probably see that as well. While some of my thinking intends to build upon and expand the work I've done for a book on the history of Jews and Christians in Capernaum, which Christina just mentioned, a lot of it is also brand new research, so don't be surprised in the Q&A if I have to answer your questions with, I don't know, or I'll look into that. So to introduce you to the project, I'd like to start by tackling briefly two sets of questions that most researchers in synagogue studies have to face. The first is, what were synagogues during this stretch of time? In other words, how do we go about defining and categorizing ancient synagogues when we see them, or at least when we think we see them? The second one is, how did ancient synagogues change over time? Why and what impact did these changes have within their broader social and cultural contexts? So to the first question, what were synagogues during this stretch of time that we're dealing with, we can answer, well, not this. In a time before Judaism represented a discrete and consolidated religious phenomenon, ancient Jews assembled in a wide variety of local institutional contexts. While we can today call these institutions synagogues for analytical purposes, we need to be aware that ancient synagogues were quite different than the Jewish houses of worship that many of us might be familiar with today. In the first centuries of the Common Era, synagogues, or local assemblies in which Jewish ancestral tradition was in some way, shape, or form interpreted and performed, generally fell into two types. And this is a scholarly typology, not necessarily arising from the sources themselves. But on the one hand, you have public or civic synagogues, and then on the other hand, association or association type synagogues. In Roman Palestine, where Jewish communities were allowed to self-administer on local levels, synagogues could function as public institutions, being referred to in the primary sources not only by the familiar Greek term synagogue, synagogue, or assembly or gathering or something like that, but also Hebrew and Latin terms of assembly as well. While public civic synagogues housed regular ritual performances, such as the reading and interpretation of Jewish ancestral writings, they also functioned as libraries, courtrooms, banks, banqueting halls, town council halls, and just simply community centers. Now, using the term public to describe these municipal institutions does not mean we should assume that all Jews participated equally, regularly, or with the same autonomy in the life of their local assembly. Some sources suggest that one could find both rich and poor, sick and healthy, congregating in these social spaces. Similar sources, however, indicate that the rich were sometimes given seats of honor and shown preferential treatment, while the poor were relegated to less visible and less desirable seating. Sources from early Roman Palestine, that's about the 1st century CE or so, don't give us much on the status of women and slaves in civic synagogues, but some from nearby regions do document the presence of both in similar assembly environments. Several inscriptions from the northern Black Sea region indicate that slaves could be manumitted in synagogues, but at the same time were often required by their former owners to remain under the, quote, guardianship of the synagogue of the Jews, as a stipulation of the release. Inscriptions from other contexts show that women could be rulers, archaeology, or rulers of the synagogue. While this probably doesn't mean that synagogues everywhere in antiquity had standard policies on gender equality, it does suggest that they were not always monogendered, as seems to have been largely the case in analogous Greco-Roman public assemblies. The archaeological record of buildings identified as synagogues from Roman Palestine has steadily grown ever since the late 1990s and seems to support the idea that local Jewish communities could assemble in purpose-built public edifices. These buildings were usually designed with characteristic features of public architecture from the Greco-Roman world, with columns and stepped benches lining all four walls. The spatial focal point in these buildings was clearly the center, which made their design conducive for deliberative style assemblies that centered on debate and argumentation. In most of the earliest buildings we have on record, there is very little materially or iconographically that clearly identifies them as synagogues, at least if by that term we mean an assembly space for the practice of Jewish ancestral tradition. But in 2010, a building that architecturally was very similar to other buildings that had for a long time been identified as synagogues was discovered, and this building did show clear evidence that it functioned as an assembly space for a local first-century Jewish community. And I mention it specifically here because I've done some of my own excavation work at the site. This building was discovered as part of a salvage excavation in Magdala, an ancient Jewish town on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, or the Kinneret Lake, with legendary associations with Mary Magdalene, known from the New Testament. It is now part of an archaeological park visited by Jews and Christians of all stripes. While the building is interesting in and of itself, the most striking discovery of all was a uniquely decorated stone table found in situ in the building's main hall. And that's the image on the right there. While much of its iconography of the stone here is enigmatic, very difficult to really get a sense of what's happening, on the face of it had been carved a clear image of a seven-branched candelabrum, the Jerusalem temple menorah. And just as a side note, Magdala continues to be a very interesting place to dig. Just in 2021, about 200 meters away from this synagogue here, another synagogue was found. So this is a unique phenomenon to have two synagogue buildings found in one small-ish Jewish town in this period of time. In settings outside of Roman Palestine, in which Jewish communities did not have the same self-administrative privileges, Jews gathered in synagogues that were organizationally modeled on the Greco-Roman associations. These types of synagogues could also be referred to by a range of ancient terms, and the assemblies themselves could take place in a variety of spaces. For example, in rented rooms, renovated houses, restaurants, and borrowed public spaces like theaters. Such synagogues were not civic institutions or the gatherings of the popular assembly of a Jewish community, but were rather elective, membership-based, and formed around different kinds of social networks. In other words, Jewish ethnicity or cult devotion to the Jewish God was not always the primary criterion for participation in association-type synagogues. For example, trade or occupation, neighborhood links, or shared ideology could serve instead as a primary social connector. So importantly, in these association-type synagogues, Jews and, in principle, non-Jews could participate as co-members. And I'll say more about the involvement of non-Jews in these types of synagogue spaces later in the talk. But regarding Jewish-Christian relations, it's worth noting here that association synagogues seem to be the primary institutional context for the spread of the early Jewish Jesus movement, the first followers of Jesus, among non-Jews throughout the Mediterranean world, as we see in some early Christian sources. So the institutional diversity of synagogues in the first few centuries of the Common Era meant that there really was no such thing as the synagogue in antiquity. meaning a central religious institution that was the same everywhere and that had shaped the way that Jews everywhere thought about their Jewishness. But this is the point where it becomes interesting to study synagogues in the Roman Empire from a longer-term historical or diachronic perspective. As we move into a period commonly labeled Late Antiquity, a period that for me covers the post-Constantinian 4th century to around the middle of the 7th century with the Byzantine Islamic transition, we can detect changes in how synagogues were both physically built and ideologically perceived by both Jews and non-Jews. It might come as a surprise that in the late 4th and 5th century CE, the concept of an ethno-religiously homogeneous institution called the synagogue was not invented by Jews, but by Christians. In a time when Christianity and Roman imperial power had become intricately linked, even synonymous, Christian religious experts increasingly engaged in the task of constructing and controlling the boundaries of Orthodox Christian identity, which was equivalent for them to Roman imperial identity. For example, sometime in the 5th century CE, a short but what would become an immensely influential literary work was anonymously penned, now known as the Dispute Between the Church and the Synagogue, Ecclesia and Synagoga. The work presents two women, Ecclesia, church, and Synagoga, synagogue, arguing in a fictional courtroom over who has the right to possess the world. The dispute, however, is rigged from the start. The work has a clear polemical agenda, which is laid out in an introduction by the anonymous author, who describes Synagoga as a disgraced, adulterous woman, weak in the eyes on the one hand, and Ecclesia as a chaste and deserving matron on the other. While the women go on to argue over various topics, Ecclesia's voice dominates the discourse. Of the first 120 lines of spoken text or so, 2/3 are spoken by Ecclesia. But throughout the text, normativizing rhetoric is employed to demonstrate the utter superiority of Ecclesia over Synagoga. The latter not only loses the court case, of course she was set up to lose, but she is also stripped of all her integrity and virtue as well. In the view of the text author, Synagoga is a metaphorical stand-in for the Jewish people as a whole, who are characterized as weak in the eyes, or blind and depraved and rejected by their own God. But perhaps even more basically, the aim of the dispute, this text, is not only to fill the sails of Christian triumphalism with hot air, it is also, and perhaps mainly, to reify Jewish and Christian difference, as it pits church and synagogue against each other as if they were diametrically opposed institutions of two diametrically opposed religions. That is, the allegory of Ecclesia and Synagoga means to create and control the boundary between a consolidated imperial Christianity, Ecclesia, after all, is said to have the explicit and exclusive support of Augustan law, and a Judaism that functions as an all too familiar other, capital O, which never was outlawed, but was classified by the roughly contemporaneous Theodosian Code, which I'll say more about later, as among the religious deviants of the empire. In response to this ideology of Christian triumphalism, some Jewish communities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean sought to consolidate their understandings of their Jewish identity and invest high levels of resources into building the very institution that had become the target of anti-Jewish polemics and law. The late 4th and 5th centuries saw a concentrated boom in the birth of what are typically called monumental synagogues that were generally much larger in scale and more richly decorated in their art and architecture than synagogues from earlier periods. With characteristics such as grand facadal entrances, finely ornamented friezes, and large mosaic pavements, these synagogues were anything but the kind of impoverished portrait projected by Christian heresiologists. Rather than poor, dilapidated, and weak in the eyes, monumental synagogues emerged as what architectural anthropologist Lisa Finley has termed confrontational buildings. That is, within their broader political context, the way that these synagogues occupied space, visually and concretely, could be understood as a discursive tool used by Jewish communities to confront and resist the increasingly oppressive laws and ideology of imperial Christianity. The fact that many of these monumental synagogues were erected at a time precisely when Roman law was trying to prohibit the construction of new synagogues, highlights their confrontational and resistive aspects. Synagogues in Palestine were, by the 5th and 6th centuries, no longer allowed to, by law, to function as civic institutions in light of stricter Byzantine administrative policies. Nevertheless, some Jewish communities seem to have had a keen awareness of the capacity of their buildings to function pragmatically, yes, but also symbolically as a spatialized framework for the projection of a renewed Jewish cultural agency and visibility. That is, the response to imperial power from some Jewish communities in this period was, quite simply, to do as power does, to transform space. For when space is occupied differently, the dynamics of power, transmission of knowledge, and modes of acting and being acted upon are likewise transformed. On the other hand, some Jewish communities were also keenly and no doubt painfully aware that such spatial strategies did not preclude some of the most extreme forms of Christian hostility. As some sources suggest, including a few sets of archaeological remains, Christians in certain parts of the empire sometimes took the confrontation to an entirely different level by burning synagogues to the ground. It appears to have gotten bad enough in some regions of the empire that several laws were issued from Constantinople in an attempt to prevent the unlawful destruction of synagogues, particularly prohibiting the death of these buildings by fire. At this point, I haven't done a whole lot of work yet on synagogues in the context of the Byzantine Islamic transition in the 7th century, but I do want to offer a few comments, at least tentatively, okay? So keep that in mind when you ask questions about this period. In the 7th century, we see a spike in the eschatological imaginations of Jews in Palestine, as Sasanian Persia and after it, the Rashidun Caliphate, moved west to overtake Byzantine rule in Syria, Palestine, North Africa, and parts of eastern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. During this time, piyutim, or Hebrew and Aramaic poetry used in synagogue liturgies were composed, which variously referred to these Eastern empires in apocalyptic terms as part of a divinely orchestrated eschatological war that would result in the deliverance of the Jewish people from the oppressive Byzantine Christian regime. From this perspective, synagogues appear to have functioned in some settings, in which through the medium of liturgy, the fires of anti-Byzantine apocalyptic fervor could be kindled and stoked. For some Jews, this fervor seems to have actually translated into direct action. When the Sasanian Shah Khosrow II sent his forces to capture Jerusalem from the Byzantines in the year 614, a group of anti-Byzantine Jewish rebels joined the Persian army and aided it to victory. However, the Sasanian hold on territory seized from the Byzantines was fleeting, and according to some sources, this had catastrophic consequences for Jewish communities in Palestine more broadly. When the Byzantines retook Jerusalem in around the year 630, many Jews were apparently massacred in retaliation. Just a decade or so later, the Rashidun army under Caliph Umar took their own shot at the Byzantines and would eventually do what the Persians could not. While some Jewish communities continue to express the same kind of apocalyptic wishful thinking in their synagogues, they don't appear to have been keen on offering the same kind of military support to the Rashidun. This probably had nothing to do with the fact that the coming force was an Islamic army, but everything to do with Jewish memory of the recent and traumatic past. The last time Jews had joined forces with an army from the east against the Byzantines, the plan had painfully backfired. This time it was better to take a wait-and-see approach. 7th century accounts, Christian accounts, of the Byzantine Islamic transition describe the transition in terms of hellfire and brimstone, wide-scale destruction, and as if the apocalypse had dawned. While many 20th and early 21st century historians have believed these accounts, recent scholarship has pointed to the nearly complete lack of archaeological evidence for such a violent transition. The expansion of Islamic politics and culture into what had been Byzantine Syria, Palestine, and Egypt seems to have been much more subtle and gradual. In the end, while the emergence of Islamic rule did not bring about the messianic emancipation that many Jews had hoped for, life under the early caliphs does seem to have been better than it had been under the Byzantine emperors. Their treatment of synagogues seems to be an example of this. In a recent study, Rick Bonney has surveyed a number of sources that show that far from being targets of anti-Jewish violence, synagogues in early Islamic Palestine flourished and continued in their use by Jewish communities. While not quite a bastion of the modern ideal of religious pluralism, early Islamic policies, including the Quran itself, guaranteed the protection of synagogues. And in an interesting, perhaps even ironic twist of fate, the so-called Pact of Umar, a short early Islamic text that probably originated around the year 640, toward the end of Umar's life, takes many of the earlier Byzantine laws that repressed synagogues and applies them to Christians and their churches. Thus, while Jewish communities still ran up against certain other restrictive policies with their new Islamic overlords, neither they nor their synagogues seem to have run up against the same ideological and political opposition that they had experienced from imperial Christianity. Despite changes in institutional function and shifts in political context, one significant point of continuity in the history of ancient synagogues is that they never came under a central governing authority that regulated what they had to look like, who could enter them, or what people had to do inside them. Not even the rabbis or the Jewish patriarch had official control over synagogues. As far as I'm aware, it's not until the composition of the Shulchan Aruch, a 16th century Jewish law code, that certain requirements for synagogues are brought together. But even law codes like this have not been observed equally by all Jewish communities everywhere. The assumption that ancient synagogues were marked by universal norms and what in my view has fed the notion, still pervasive in a lot of scholarship, that they were ethno-religiously bound Jewish institutions that had mainly antagonistic relations with their pagan and Christian neighbors. But while some sources might render this impression, others render a different one, in which the boundaries between synagogues and non-Jews seem to have been quite porous and unpoliced. And this is the point that brings me to sort of the neck of our hourglass and operates as the basic point of departure for my current project. So I'm interested in understanding the phenomenon of non-Jewish affiliation with synagogues within their larger socio-religious landscape of the Roman world, and how this social phenomenon might impact the way that we write histories about, more specifically, early Jewish-Christian relations. In the rest of my talk, I want to introduce to you several of the primary sources that I've been working through, and then discuss in general terms my current thinking on how they might help us reset the historiographical stage. Basically, from their beginnings, ancient synagogues were anything but bound and isolated institutions, but were instead very much in conversation with their broader social and cultural environments, just as Jews themselves were. As buildings, synagogues often imitated the architectural tastes of the Greco-Roman world. In late antiquity, synagogues were sometimes mistaken for pagan temples, even by Jews, a mistake which seems to have happened frequently enough that some rabbis felt compelled to discuss its religious legal implications in the Talmud. One of the ways that synagogues showed their engagement with the broader Roman religious landscape was by having pagan patrons. Perhaps the best example of this is the well-known synagogue of Julia Severa from 1st and 2nd century Achaemonia, a city in western Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Julia Severa is mentioned in two contemporaneous inscriptions from the city. One mentions that she was a, quote, high priestess and director of contests of the whole household of the Augustan gods. As we know from other sources, she, along with her Italian husband, L. Servinius Captio, were members of a prominent family that was full of high-ranking imperial officials, especially throughout Asia Minor. In other words, Julia Severa was high up on the ladder of the Roman ruler cult and civic politics. On the other hand, another inscription mentions that this same Julia Severa had built a synagogue for the Jewish community of Achaemonia. This inscription mentions that her synagogue was then later renovated by three men: P. Tironius Clados, this is a quote, head of the synagogue for life; Lucius, son of Lucius, also head of the synagogue; and Popilius, Zotikos' leader. Interestingly, all three of these donors received the honor of a gilded shield from the city's synagogue, which according to Roman custom seems to have been a symbol of social and political alliance. Julia Severa's position as a leader in the traditional Roman religion has led some scholars to the conclusion that her patronage to the Jewish assembly in the city was merely external. That is, despite her beneficence to the assembly, she did not participate in it in really any meaningful sense. To be sure, such external patronage was one of the primary types of socioeconomic agreements that marked patron-clients in the Greco-Roman world. But the claim that Julia Severa was not a member of or internally involved in the Synagogue of Achamonia because she was also a prominent leader in the imperial cult is often based on the assumption of a static dividing line between Jews and non-Jews in antiquity. As Paula Fredrickson has forcefully argued, it is misguided to assume that all non-Jews who were attracted in some way to Jewish ancestral traditions simply abandoned their ethnic cults and became strict henotheists, or worshippers of one god. Some pagans probably did, but many and perhaps most did not. And this might be precisely why some synagogues, ranging from the 1st to the 7th century, evince a comfortability with the presence of pagan gods in name and form within their walls. For example, some 1st century inscriptions from the Black Sea region mentioning the manumission of a slave in a synagogue, here called a prosophe, or prayer hall, start with an invocation to the Jewish deity, to the God Most High, Almighty and Blessed, and then close with an oath to the Greek gods Zeus, Gaia, and Helios. Interestingly, in later centuries, the last of these deities, Helios, famously appears in the center of a zodiac cycle on the mosaic floors of several Palestinian synagogues. While some scholars have interpreted the Helios iconography in these buildings as renditions of figures known from early Jewish apocalyptic traditions, it's also quite possible that the iconography here is a representation, quite straightforwardly, of Helios as himself, Sol Invictus, the Greco-Roman god of the sun. Indeed, as Glenn Bowersock has shown, the legacy of Hellenism, everything from its art, architecture, literature, and mythology of the gods, lived on and continued to be deeply embedded in the cultures of late antiquity. Jewish culture was no different. After all, as some of the so-called magical materials from the period indicate, at least some ancient Jews attributed apotropaic power to various non-Jewish gods and enlisted their help in everyday life. This observation might very well lend some credence to a tentative, yet highly intriguing possibility raised by Mary Jane Coiler in her very recent study, 2023, of 2 terracotta figurines, one apparently depicting Venus and the other a Roman lar, that were discovered in the Ostia Synagogue complex in 1962, but have only recently garnered some wider attention. These figurines were found extremely well preserved as part of what seems to have been a ritual deposit, which Coiler assigns broadly to the first half of the 3rd century CE. Coiler raises the distinct possibility that if the building was in use already in this period as a synagogue, and that is a big if, the figurines could be evidence that at least some Jews in Ostia did not think it was out of the ordinary to see statues of Venus and Lar, and I would add their pagan devotees, in a Jewish deity association, that is a synagogue. This, of course, doesn't mean that all Jews always or even regularly engaged with Roman gods in the same way that they did their own ethnic deity. But on the other hand, it does suggest that in a variety of geographical contexts, over a significant stretch of time, the attachment of non-Jews to their traditional ethnic cults was not perceived as antithetical to their simultaneous involvement in worship of the Jewish deity in synagogue spaces. While the Jewish God could naturally be perceived as the theos hupsistos, the highest God, in Jewish thinking about the realm of the divine, Jews, like other ethnic groups, were conversant and well practiced in the theistic traditions of the Roman world. An interesting example of this type of attitude, I think, in which Jewish cultic tradition is observed right alongside Roman tradition, is the so-called Glikon grave inscription from the 2nd or 3rd century Hierapolis in southwestern Anatolia. Again, we're in modern-day Turkey. This inscription was carved into a limestone sarcophagus of a man named Publius Aelius Glikon, who was either Jewish himself or potentially a non-Jew who had in some way adopted Jewish cultic practices. The content of this inscription pulls an association of carpet weavers into observance of both the festival of Kalends and the festival of Pentecost, known as Shavuot in Hebrew. The Kalends was a Roman festival that marked the first day of the month. It was sacred to the goddess Juno, signaled by the offering of sacrifice to her. Pentecost was originally a Jewish agricultural festival that came later to be associated with, in rabbinic tradition, with the God of Israel's revelation of the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai. And it was actually just celebrated in many contemporary Jewish communities this past weekend. This association of carpet weavers was a synagogue, a synedrion is the term, in the sense that Jews and or Jewish ancestral tradition were part of the group's membership and cultic activities, and yet it participated unproblematically in both Roman and Jewish practices. Fredrickson, therefore, puts the situation nicely when she says, quote, Jewish cultic exclusivity did not preclude other sorts of lower-level engagements with between Jewish humans and non-Jewish deities, as our amulets, inscriptions, and papyri attest. Antiquity's universe was a God-congested place. Jews knew this as well as did the next ancient person, end quote. Admittedly, these broad comments don't allow us to say much about what Julia Severa's participation in the Acmonian synagogue might have looked like beyond her patronage. But we don't have any direct information, like we do, for example, about a person named Claudius Tiberius Polemarchus, another wealthy Roman donor to a synagogue in Stobi in Macedonia, who is said to have conducted himself in accordance with Iudaismos, or with Judaism. On the other hand, we do have numerous literary sources from the days of the early Roman Empire that recount, usually condemningly, that it was not uncommon for people, even elites, to experiment with cults and diviners that the literary elite considered, quote-unquote, foreign or un-Roman in their effort to solicit knowledge and assistance from the gods. As Heidi Wendt has shown, these foreign cults are often ethnically coded in the ancient sources, meaning that certain religious practices were associated with a particular ethnic group or region, such as the Chaldeans or the Egyptians, the Persians, and yes, the Judeans or the Jews. Jewish religious experts, for their part, were especially well known for peddling to non-Jews their apparent abilities in exorcism, prophecy, dream interpretation, and divination or wisdom instruction from their authoritative writings. In response, some Roman authors, such as the historian Tacitus and the satirical poet Juvenal, went to great lengths to criticize Jewish religious practices, including what Jews do in their synagogues, for their foreignness, asserting their radical incongruity with Roman custom and condemning any Roman who participates in them. While we can't assume that such interest in religious experimentation motivated Julia Severa's beneficence towards the Jewish community in Acmonia, it is indeed possible. The same possibility exists for people who are, in some Jewish sources, called Godfearers. The concept of the Godfearers, which finds linguistic expression in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew sources, is broad and indeed potentially ambiguous. In Greek and Roman literature, it could refer to anyone who simply showed public piety towards the gods. In late antiquity, Christians could use it to speak of good imperial Romans who not only feared the Christian God, but who also feared the Christian emperor who had been appointed by God himself. However, there are a number of Jewish sources that seem to employ the terminology of God-fearer specifically as a reference to non-Jews who are attracted to the cult of the Jewish deity. That is, the type of people that some Roman sources criticized for being attracted to foreign religious practices. The newest evidence for this type of God-fearer is another manumission inscription dated to around the 1st century CE, which was found on the Kerch Peninsula in the eastern Crimea, now illegally occupied by Russia. While the inscription was discovered in 2007, it was not published until 2018. Like several other similar inscriptions found in the same region in the early to mid-20th century, the new inscription documents the release of a slave in the socio-spatial setting of a synagogue, here identified again by the terms prosevche, or prayer hall, and also synagogue, or assembly, or a gathering or synagogue. While this inscription and others like it raise a number of interesting questions about the identity and status of slaves in Jewish communities during the early Roman Empire, The unique thing about this particular inscription is that it clearly identifies the synagogue as being a synagogue of Jews and God-fearers. This is significant for two reasons. First, the inscription provides evidence for a synagogue whose membership was not strictly defined by way of Jewish ethnic identity, but also by way of cult participation. In other words, an interest in offering cult to the Jewish God is what granted a person access to the synagogue, not whether a person was Jewish. Second, this inscription seems to allow us to go beyond the Julius Caesar inscription in that it suggests non-Jews were attracted to synagogues beyond the role of elite patronage. That is, the God-fearers here do not seem to have been a marginal group within this association-style synagogue, but rather on par with its Jewish members, at least equal enough so that the assembly could be defined in relation to them also. Now, unfortunately, again, we're left without some specifics concerning the behavioral characteristics of these God-fearers, what they actually did in these spaces. Their status as non-Jews seems pretty clear, and we can probably assume that they participated somehow in the practice of Jewish ancestral tradition. But we probably shouldn't assume that their participation meant at the same time their departure from worship of their native deities and the gods of Rome. While some ancient Jews, such as members of the early Jesus movement and the early rabbis, seem to have wanted non-Jews affiliated with synagogues to do this, to abandon their traditional gods, these were in fact marginal views in the first few centuries of the Common Era. In other words, these God-fearers could have, in principle, offered cult to the Jewish God on Saturday, and then offered cult to Helios on Sunday. While often relegated to marginal roles in historiographies of Jewish-Christian relations, several kinds of sources suggest that non-Jews, whether they were explicitly called God-fearers or not, continued to participate in synagogues well into late antiquity. In Aphrodisias, a city in western Anatolia, which in the 5th century was still a pagan center, the names of 54 God-fearers were carved on 2 late 4th or 5th century monumental inscriptions, along with the names of 68 Jews and 3 proselytes. All of them are said to be members of a type of synagogue for, quote, those who love learning and those who fervently praise God. About 150 kilometers southeast of Aphrodisias, in the now famous Monumental synagogue from the city of Sardis, 6 out of a total of 80 inscriptions identified donors to the synagogue as God-fearers. What's interesting about these inscriptions is their broader social context. In 5th and 6th century Sardis, Jews and Christians owned and occupied shops that lined the colonnaded streets outside the wall of the synagogue, trading, as Jody Magnus puts it, side by side. So in my view, it's not difficult to imagine that in such a highly interactive socioeconomic setting, the city's synagogue was able to solicit participation from interested Christians doing business nearby. In other words, these God-fearers mentioned as donors to the Sardis synagogue could very well have been Christians. The participation of Christians in synagogues during late antiquity seems to have been widespread enough to occupy the anxious pens and mouths of imperial legislators and Orthodox theologians alike. Just as earlier Roman authors in the edicts of emperors had attacked people who experimented with foreign cults deemed to be beyond the pale of Romanness, imperial Christian law and literature explicitly and unabashedly criticized Christians who participated in synagogue life with Jewish communities. When read against the grain, these sources shed a considerable light on how pervasive the phenomenon seems to have been. While rabbinic literature can variously express its own polemical outlook against Christians, nowhere do the rabbis express the same kind of clear prohibition against Christian involvement in synagogues than Christian legal literature itself does. For example, the Apostolic Canons, a collection of ecclesiastical laws redacted sometime between the 4th and the 6th century, contains unfeigned anxiety about the participation of Christian clerics and lay people in synagogues. Thus, we see canons prohibiting Christians from entering a synagogue to pray with Jews, that's Canon 65, from co-celebrating Sabbaths and Jewish holidays, that's Canon 70, and from providing oil to synagogues for lamplighting rituals, that's Canon 71. As Seth Schwartz has noted, Roman imperial laws were usually reactive. That is, they were usually responses to conditions brought to the attention of the emperors by administrators or private citizens. Ecclesiastical laws were really no different. The canon's prohibition of Christian participation in synagogues, as well as pagan temples, for that matter, were likely a response to social conditions that were relatively widely spread and deemed problematic enough for laws to be issued as a regulatory response. Indeed, Christians with one foot in church and the other in synagogue were apparently numerous enough and caused enough headaches for gatekeepers of imperial Christian identity that they are addressed in the Theodosian Code, that compendium of imperial Christian law par excellence, redacted sometime in the middle of the 5th century. Of note here is that some of the legislation negatively targets a group called the heaven-fearers, the calicularum, whom the code portrays as renegade Christians who had gotten too close to Judaism and Jews. These Christians, according to the code, had, quote, abjured the Christian faith and had become polluted with the Jewish incredulity, whatever that means. As non-Jews who were attracted to Judaism, they were akin to the Godfearers, we've now mentioned on several occasions, and indeed some scholars have suggested that the term heaven-fearers is simply a synonym for God-fearers. But interestingly, a similar group of heaven-fearers is also mentioned in contemporaneous rabbinic literature, where they are known in Hebrew as yarei shamayim and presented in a much more positive light. While they are not explicitly associated with Christianity, to me it does make sense that in using the phrase, the rabbis are referring to those the Theodosian Code calls the calicularum. After all, the rabbis have another term for another term to refer more generally to a non-Jew who is sympathetic to the teachings of Judaism, and that's the righteous Gentile. So whereas heaven-fearers are a destabilizing social phenomenon that the Theodosian Code feels compelled to redress, they don't seem to pose much of a problem for the rabbis. No doubt the harshest polemical attack on Christian participation in synagogues came from the so-called golden mouth of the Christian East, the late 4th and early 5th century preacher from Syrian Antioch, John Chrysostom. In Antioch, in the years 386 and 387, Chrysostom launched a full-frontal verbal assault on synagogues and any Christian who went near them in his 8 homilies titled Against the Jews. You can tell his motivation there. Here's a short list of some of the language he uses in his construction of the idea of the synagogue. He calls it a gathering place for effeminates, so it's gendered space, a rubbish heap of harlots, a shrine of men who have been rejected, dishonored, and condemned, a lodging place for robbers and cheats. Okay, you get the point. He doesn't really hold back. Well, in these homilies, Chrysostom certainly expends a lot of energy demonizing Jews themselves. He is much more frustrated over the fact that members of his Antiochene church are in droves participating in the ongoings of synagogue life. Sabbaths, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Pesach, and other festival days have been attracting Christians to synagogues like honey to a brown bear. Some were even fully converting to Judaism. Chrysostom saw this as a problem for the stability of his church and more broadly for the formation of imperial Orthodox identity. Indeed, Christianity itself, especially in Antioch, was far from a stable category as Christians of various theological stripes competed over power and political support. Thus, the synagogue, as both physical and socio-religious space, was primarily cannon fodder for Chrysostom's construction of an enemy around which Christians could more or less coalesce. One of the things Chrysostom evidently had a particular problem with is Christians who went to synagogues to be healed of their illnesses. He describes them as charm users and as those who forbiddingly tie tokens around their neck for their supposed apotropaic capabilities. While Chrysostom's rhetorical construction of the synagogue and Jewish people was a making of his own venomous fantasy, the idea that Christians perceived synagogues to have a numinous appeal and emuletic power does seem to reflect what Ra'anan Bustan and Joseph Sanzo have called the, quote, shared magical culture of late antiquity. By this, Bustan and Sanzo mean that Jews and Christians participated in many of the same material, cultural, and ritual textual practices related to invoking the divine for help on earth. What's interesting for me about this is that synagogue spaces seem to have been part of this shared culture. As part of my time at SCAS, I've been working on a small copper amulet that just might be precisely the type of object whose use preachers like John Chrysostom condemned, and whose archaeological context might suggest it was used in connection to a synagogue setting. This past November, I was granted access to examine this magical pendant, which is now held in the storerooms of the Terra Sancta Museum in Jerusalem. The pendant was found during excavations in the 70s and 80s at Capernaum, a small village on the northwestern shore of the Lake of Galilee, which we've talked about now, with a long history of Jewish and Christian populations. While the object itself is not unique, the pendant's find site in a room just off the northeast corner of Capernaum's Monumental Synagogue, as well as the larger multi-religious environment of Capernaum itself, make it an interesting object with which to think about ancient Christian attitudes towards participation in synagogues. The pendant has a suspension loop, meaning that it likely functioned to be worn on a string or a rope around the neck. It has Greek inscriptions on both sides. It includes references to drinking and health. And it invokes the name of Iao, the name of the Jewish deity in a form found commonly on amuletic sources from late antiquity, whether Christian, Jewish, Egyptian, or what have you. The pendant, therefore, seems to fit the category of digestive amulets. Amulets imbued with remedial powers to ward off and heal digestive sicknesses. There's no way of knowing for sure the identities of the maker or the user of the object, whether they were both Jewish, both Christian, or whether it was one of each. But if this amulet was indeed a type of token charm that was meant to be worn around the neck, we could rather easily imagine that it was used by a Christian who was attracted to the town's synagogue for its perceived magical powers. And to my mind, who wouldn't be? The art and architecture of this building was, and of course I'm biased because I'm working on this for my book, is still breathtakingly enchanting. Okay, as we come to the lower bulb of our hourglass and the conclusion, I promise we're coming quickly here, I want to zoom back out and make some brief comments about the significance of all of this for how we write and think about the histories of early Jewish-Christian relations. One of the ideas that's emerged in my research so far is the need to connect synagogues and Jewish-Christian relations diachronically and comparatively to the broader religious landscape of the Roman Empire. That is, when Christians participated in synagogues, it seems to me that they were doing very close to the same thing that cultically curious pagans had been doing for a long time, as they experimented with so-called foreign religious practices in their quest to obtain knowledge and assistance from the divine. The polemical reactions that such Christians elicited in late antiquity from Orthodox heresiologists, Orthodox there in quotes, were largely the same as those that cultically curious pagans had earlier elicited from the likes of Roman ethnographers, poets, and legislators in the earlier days of the empire who sought to guard the gates of Romanness. In other words, Christian attraction to synagogues didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was a phenomenon long and deeply embedded in the flux and fluidity of everyday Roman religious sensibilities. And this flux and fluidity didn't end when Rome became a Christian empire. In fact, it probably became even stronger, which would explain the great increase in efforts to control it. When we see things from this broader diachronic and comparative perspective, Christian attraction to synagogues as a social phenomenon becomes neither abnormal nor uncommon in this period of Roman history. Indeed, at this point, I'm tempted to say, I might get some strong reactions in the Q&A on this, but I'm going to say it anyways. I'm tempted to say that such so-called boundary crossing, not only involving Jews and Christians, but also pagans and other deviants of the empire, was closer to the norm, on the ground, so to say, and that it was actually less common for average people to hold the dichotomizing and polemical views of the lawmakers and literary elite that tried to convince them to follow suit. From this perspective, considering the role of synagogues in the early history of Jewish-Christian relations allows us to construct a more complicated narrative than those that center on the synagogue as an irreconcilable rival to Christianity. On the one hand, to be sure, our stories need to account for sources that suggest that synagogues and the Jewish communities that occupied them could indeed be the targets of rhetorical and physical violence by both pagans and later imperial Christians. And for their part, synagogues in late antiquity could architecturally and liturgically reinforce a sense of Jewish self-definition in opposition to the ideological claims of Christian empire. But on the other hand, if we stopped there, our story would be incomplete, and we might be tempted to tell a tidy tale of the inevitability of Christianity's triumph and Judaism's struggle for survival. We'd miss the point that synagogues were part of the broader socio-religious landscape over the Roman world, and as such, they were dynamic in the way that they related to their non-Jewish contexts. We'd miss the point that synagogues, to put it bluntly, were interesting institutions that exerted a certain appeal to non-Jews too. It's possible that some Christians were attracted to synagogues simply because they wanted to appropriate them for Christian use, but most of our sources for the phenomenon portray a scenario in which Christians seem to have been attracted to synagogue life in and of itself because they thought synagogues had something to offer of their own accord. We should recall that Jewish communities in many parts of the empire were flourishing during these centuries, and that despite some restrictive legislation in the 5th and 6th centuries, they seem to have been relatively well integrated and established in Roman society. The desire to participate in the ongoings of such communities isn't that hard to explain, especially if one thought that their buildings had magical healing powers or divinatory powers, or that their assemblies provided beneficial social and economic networking possibilities or opportunities. And this last point is worth underlining. While most of the sources I've discussed focus on cult, or what we tend to call religion, as the primary tie that drew non-Jews into the orbit of synagogues, our historiographies of Jewish-Christian relations also need to take seriously the role of the mundane. For example, it's possible that the synagogue of carpet weavers that we mentioned earlier, that are mentioned in the Glikon inscription, and the Godfearers mentioned in the donor inscription from the Sardis synagogue, cared more about job prospects and having paying customers than their own cultic convictions as they affiliated with Jewish customs and assemblies. We could think of it this way, pragmatically, even if a bit crudely. It would have been extremely bad for business if, for example, Christians in Sardis had embodied the rhetoric of John Chrysostom and burned the city synagogue down. Tactical pragmatism, the art of making do, and building strategic relationships can sometimes, or even often, win the day. The role of synagogues in the mundanity of Jewish-Christian relations, such as in trade and economic networks, is a topic I'll be working on in the coming months and integrating into the work I've done so far. So to conclude, at the very least, I hope this project will push historiography in the direction of telling not happy history, but a more contoured narrative about the place of synagogues in the early history of Jewish-Christian relations. Focusing on synagogues as only the targets of hostility and violence misses out on their social and cultural dynamism and the impact that dynamism had on a variety of ancient people, Christians included. In other words, as we tell stories about what Christianity cost the Jews, as one prominent scholar has framed it, we can't forget to tell stories about what synagogues offered the world of antiquity. Thank you.